I'm deeply honored and moved by the addresses of Rectoratore, Professor Riga, and Professor Bartole. Thank you very much. Law legitimates power. Constitutionalism has played an increasingly dominant role in this process of legitimation over the past century. Its rise has profoundly reshaped modern notions of lawful authority. But how? I better take a break. Lots of historical studies provide insights into one or another polity or region. Yet it has been difficult to organize the bewildering complexity of global experience into a compelling comparative framework. We can make life easy for ourselves by supposing that constitutionalism is a one-size-fits-all ideal that animates a common project throughout the world. But this seems very unlikely, to put it mildly. Once we recognize the deep differences across the globe, a fundamental problem emerges: how to distinguish the accidental from the truly fundamental. Max Weber asked himself a similar question when confronting a political universe. He too rejected the idea that political power appealed to a single legitimating logic, famously distinguishing between the very different appeals of tradition, charisma, and bureaucratic authority. This trichotomy remains relevant, but it fails to recognize the distinctive legitimating dynamics of constitutionalism. My work fills this gap. In future work, I will be exploring the very different pathways through which constitutions have won legitimacy over the past century. Each pathway generates a distinctive ideal type with its own sets of attractions and problems. The present lecture, however, introduces an ideal type particularly relevant to the present moment. With crises erupting throughout the world, it is tempting to believe that all of them are symptoms of the same evil called populism, which threatens to destroy the liberal constitutional project built up with such great effort in the aftermath of the Second World War. This lecture and my book on revolutionary constitutions, coming from the Harvard Press in the spring, rejects this simple diagnosis. It shows that the current constitutional systems in places as different as India and South Africa, France and Italy were propelled forward by populism and could never have gained legitimacy without the mobilized consent of ordinary citizens. Despite their obvious differences from one another, the constitutions of all these nations are rooted in a common experience in which revolutionary insurgents managed to sustain a struggle against the old order for years or decades before finally gaining political ascendancy. Call this time one. During this period, insurgents do not merely engage in complex campaigns of underground resistance and open rebellion. They issue revolutionary declarations denouncing the existing regime as illegitimate. These declarations of principle play a central role in sustaining the movement, especially during periods of adversity. During dark moments, leading activists face the prospect of detention or death at the hands of the old regime. Nevertheless, they do not give up the struggle, and it is only natural for them to tell the world why they are right to think so. Moreover, these declarations cannot be dismissed as idle talk. They were affirmed by activists with the courage to risk imprisonment or detention or death, even though they could have actively collaborated with or passively acquiesced in the existing system. It is this willingness to sacrifice personal convenience for principled conviction which earns these revolutionaries a distinctive claim to legitimacy. This history of self-sacrifice during time one sets the stage for common legitimation problems once the insurgents rise to power at time two. How can they assure themselves, as well as the more skeptical portions of the population, that they will not engage in the very same abuses of power that led them to revolt in the first place? Call this the problem of betrayal. And a revolutionary constitution tries to provide an answer to this problem. To be sure, the founding constitution will also contain many provisions that do not address it. Instead of looking backward to time one, the new constitution will also look forward to the future and try to commit the nation to one or another version of progress. I will consider these visions of progress later, but let's first focus on the never again provisions, which aim to resolve the betrayal problem. Their content will depend on the character of the evils that motivated the revolutionaries' struggle in the first place. In Italy, for example, despite their radically different visions of the future, progress, communists, socialists, and Christian Democrats joined together in a common diagnosis of the failures that permitted Mussolini to seize power in the first place. In their view, it was the flexibility of the Statuto Albertino which enabled the king to hand over power to Mussolini despite the availability of more liberal democratic options in 1921. It was therefore imperative to create a rigid constitution, creating a system of checks and balances, including the judicial protection of fundamental rights, to prevent this same tragedy from repeating itself. For all the twists and turns of later Italian history, these basic principles still govern the Republic 70 years later. In contrast, Charles de Gaulle advanced a very different diagnosis of the constitutional failures of the old regime of Vichy. Both during his time as leader of the Free French in the 1940s and during his successful effort to sweep away the Fourth Republic in the 1950s and 60s. So far as he was concerned, the parliamentary system of the Third and Fourth Republics was responsible for France's fall from greatness, encouraging party leaders in the Assembly to engage in endless power plays without taking a large view of the national interest. To ensure against this happening again, the Constitution of the Fifth Republic created a super powerful presidency, enabling the incumbent, according to de Gaulle, to transcend petty party bickering and enable France to regain its position at the center of Europe. Given de Gaulle's diagnosis, the super president was granted unilateral power to declare an emergency and arbitrarily imprison citizens without any judicial supervision. While many rights can also be found in the Gaullist constitution, these should not be numbered amongst the never-agains of the Fifth Republic's constitution. This is not what de Gaulle was rebelling against. He was rebelling against parliamentary government. This is not the case in Italy. They were rebelling against Mussolini's flexible, the Statuto, really it was the king's flexible use of the Constitution of 1848, which of course precedes Italian independence. That's how flexible it was. The Congress parties of India and South Africa constitutionalized a very different set of revolutionary commitments. In these cases, their central target was the political subordinations imposed by the previous regime's determined support of the caste system in India and apartheid in South Africa. As a consequence, the revolutionary constitutions in both countries emphatically guaranteed equal voting rights to all citizens of the new republic, which was definitely, while these provisions don't differ significantly from words on other pieces of paper, they were absolutely central in the assault on the caste system of subordination and the denial of political status to women, but also to many of the lower castes. All of them were granted equal political status, foundational, but not in Italy. The Italian evolution of women's rights proceeded not with as a central dimension of the rebellion against the Statuto, but within the constitutional framework. In all these cases, the revolutionary movements also sought to repudiate many other features of the old regime with more or less unanimity. As they move from the rejection of flexibility to other principles of equality, then the Christian Democrats, the communists, the socialists, they increasingly disagreed with one another as to what was really foundational in the assault against Mussolini. These basic facts of political life suffice to generate the next move in my argument, which seeks to establish that insurgent movements, regardless of their substantive aims, confront a race against time at time too, if they hope to hammer out a successful revolutionary constitution. To put the point first abstractly before we get to Italy, while a revolutionary movement's particular never-agains provide the ideological glue which unite the different factions in their common struggle against the old regime during time one, this glue begins to dissolve during time two, as the newly powerful leaders start disagreeing about which way they should go, which way the country should go in the future. Because they're now in power, they can shape this. These forward-looking disagreements threaten to split the revolutionaries into rival factions in a way that prevents them from working together to enact a constitution codifying the backward-looking never-agains as a foundation for their competition over the future. If this happens, the revolutionaries will lose their race against time. Since once factional divisions come to dominate the political stage, it will be very hard to recover the broad support required to anchor the popular legitimacy of the never-again constitution. When viewed in comparative terms, India and South Africa had a large advantage over Italy and France in winning the race against time. In these two cases, the mass insurgencies were organized by a single dominant organization. There were many competing factions in the Congress Party of India and in the Congress Party of South Africa. Nevertheless, leaders like Nehru and Mandela had symbolic centrality, and they had an organizational structure that would allow them to contain the very serious disagreements long enough to legitimate a constitution, which they did. In contrast, the resistance in France and Italy was fragmented into three parties: communists, socialists, and Christian Democrats. For the French case, they changed their names a lot, but I'll just call them Christian Democrats too. From this vantage point, Togliatti's turn at Salerno was a critical element in enabling the communists to join a broad-based revolutionary coalition extending to De Gasperi's Christian Democrats that made it possible to hammer out a never-again constitution before the escalating Cold War, which really begins in a serious way only with the coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948. There is this fascinating period until that time when it wasn't clear whether the Soviet Union would be part of the Marshall Plan. That was the original offer. One shouldn't impose the Cold War to 1945 or something of this kind. The French case was similar to Italy. Coordination, once again, by the communists, socialists, and popular Republicans, however, was made much more difficult by Charles de Gaulle, whose independent assertion to speak for the Free French as the victor, not really, but he made it up, of the Second World War, at least as much as the British and the Americans and to put it mildly, in contrast to Charles de Gaulle, the Italian contrast is Marshal Badoglio. Not quite the same person, leader. Let us put it that way. Nevertheless, the three-party French coalition defeated de Gaulle after 1945. They, just like the Italians, hammered together a constitution which had a referendum, and the people chose the Constitution of the Fourth Republic over de Gaulle. Indeed, they won a victory at the critical referendum on their constitution, which was more decisive, despite de Gaulle, than that achieved by their Italian counterpart. After all, they won 52 to 48, but in Italy, did they win it all? Never clear. One great act is when Umberto leaves. Whatever else one wants to say about the flexible constitution, he left. He didn't have to leave. Or at least there were people who were, and the South voted against the Republican Constitution. And it's just that the North voted a little bit more in favor than the South voted against. Nevertheless, in the French case, de Gaulle continued to remain a compelling symbol of France's wartime victory against Vichy, and he successfully exploited this fact at a moment of military weakness, threatening to lead a military coup if the civilian leadership did not give up power. This is simply ignored when you look at the standard texts of French constitutional law. It's like one little paragraph. but there was a serious military coup going on, and that was the only thing that led the President of the Republic to grudgingly concede power. Nothing other than a takeover of Paris was being threatened. Yet the general followed in the footsteps of the founders of the Fourth Republic in one important fundamental respect. Just like the founders of the Fourth Republic, just like the founders of the Italian Republic, he too moved rapidly to constitutionalize the charisma. This is a label I use, of two kinds. One, his personal charisma, but second, and no less important, the millions of followers. Within the space of a year, he had gained an overwhelming victory at a referendum in support of a constitution that repudiated the parliamentary tradition, which was, after all, rooted in the French Revolution, which had served, and also had served as in fact, the framework for French government for a century, since Magna in 1880s. He followed up this victory by installing himself in the presidency and his party in the Chamber of Deputies by sweeping margins. These victories not only served as the basis for the further development of an exceptionally strong form of presidential government in France during the next 2 centuries, it has also served as a model for many later revolutionary efforts to mark out constitutional new beginnings, often with tragic consequences. My new book argues that the Gaullist model bears a great deal of responsibility for the failure of solidarity in Poland to win its race against time and gain broad support for a revolutionary constitution. This is a very interesting phenomenon. The Americans are, after all, during all of this period, from 45 through 2001, at the very least, the hegemonic world power, not only militarily but culturally. Hollywood, from Hollywood to the McDonald's, as it were. Yet, the American model of presidential government is followed nowhere. No one follows the American model of presidential government. When they follow the presidential model, it is the French presidential model, which is falsely called semi-presidential. It is super-presidential. After 1 year, not only does the president have plenary power in foreign affairs in a way that Trump would love to make secure. He can do whatever he wants in foreign affairs, but he could also declare a state of emergency and throw people into jail. And he can also disband Parliament after 1 year, which means that the parties are very afraid of voting against his prime minister because if they vote against him, and it's a good time for the president to get a popular support, he will just disband Parliament, and many of them will lose if the president is making sense. So this is a much more powerful presidency than the American presidency. And to call it semi-presidential is simply a mischaracterization. And I call it super-presidential because that's what it is. Not a little compromise between America and European parliamentary, which is often what is portrayed. It is this superpower which makes Lech Walesa, which leads Lech Walesa to declare war against his party leaders in Parliament. There's a war at the top, which destroys the most successful popular mobilization in European history. it is not merely that overwhelming majorities of workers and rural join Solidarity. They voluntarily give 5% of their income to support the activities of 40,000 activists to organize the movement. This doesn't happen every day because, after all, if you don't give there's no enforcement. This is transitional. 5%, you know, is a significant amount of money. They're not making very much money in Poland in 1988. My own pay won't make any difference. You know, they give it. And there's this well-organized movement ready to constitutionalize the proclamations that have been issued in the underground. They fail. This terrible outcome, I suggest, my book argues, lies at the root of Poland's crisis at the present time. But I won't it should serve as a cautionary tale. I won't go into the details right now. It should serve as a cautionary tale. Beware the dangers of French-style parliamentarism. However difficult the parliamentary traditions of Italy are, it's a false illusion to think that presidentialism is the solution. And of course, this might well be on the agenda in the coming period. And if we're going to learn anything from the past and as I'm suggesting to you, there is a lot to be learned, much more than is appreciated, in a systematic comparison between Italy and France, which are very structurally similar, except for the Marshal Badoglio and de Gaulle comparison. And I'd like to conclude by emphasizing the revolutionary character of de Gasperi, which is not de Gasperi, after all, is the creator of the Christian Democratic Party, which governs the country in a hegemonic fashion, more or less, until the end of the Cold War. And we are used to thinking of de Gasperi as the creator of the Italian system, parliament. This is true, of course, but this is false foundationally. De Gasperi begins in 1910 in Turin, in the Parliament of Turin, just as the Pope has excommunicated any Catholic who is going to participate in the secular politics because he's a prisoner of the Vatican, as we all know. He lifts the ban on immediate excommunication in the early part of the 20th century. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be excommunicated. And de Gasperi makes this move to create the first, it isn't called the Christian Democrats, but a party of believing Catholics who engage in secular politics. After the war, he is the last, he isn't the first, but he's the last legal representative of the opposition against Mussolini. When he is, and Mussolini responds by wanting to kill him. He recognizes this, and he is, like Togliatti and others, running out of the country, right? He is grabbed at the railroad station. He's thrown in jail, and he is about to die. He is about to die. There's a friendly Catholic cardinal who lets him out, gets him out just as he's about to die. He re-enters the civilian world in 1928-29 as no one wants to touch him. He's a pariah. He cannot survive economically. Another friendly Catholic gets him a position as the person who gets books for you at the Vatican Library. The church has saved his life, and he opposes the Vatican Accords. He could have been fired at that point, and he died, period. No, he's bringing books for you, and then writes as Demofilo during the 1930s, condemning time and again the Vatican Accords. Of course, it's a pseudonym, but how many, pseudonyms are not a guarantee of leaking out, and it's De Gasperi and let's kill him. This is dangerous. And also affirming the program of the Christian Democratic Party, in which, by the way, judicial review is an element, in 1935. When the first convention of the new Christian Democrats meet, it is an illegal assembly. It is not legal yet. And it issues a well-developed constitutional program of constitutional democracy. It is wrong to think of the Constitution as only a creation of Calamandrei. Of course, Calamandrei plays an important role, but in order to gain legitimacy, it's this Togliatti. They're all revolutionaries. We can also talk about lots of people. Einaudi, who is the liberal and was a collaborationist. He was working for the Bank of Italy, during the period. He, however, saves his revolutionary legitimacy towards the very end of the war by going to Switzerland and divorcing himself from the Mussolini regime, not the Badoglio, not the one afterwards. So when he comes back, he has at least some revolutionary credibility. And in the effort, very creative, to build the broadest possible base for the revolutionary constitution, he becomes president. Very smart. But this is populism. Creating an authentic constitution for we, the Republic of Italy, based on work, notice, which is, of course, all right. So the most important thing about this lecture is to encourage you actually to take systematically the French and Italian comparisons very seriously, as well as the Italian-German one, because the German one is my other model of an imposed constitution. Because Churchill is defeated. If Churchill had won again, then Italy would have been treated just like Germany. But Churchill didn't win. And Attlee had other things to do. And President Roosevelt had lots of other things to do. And within this maneuvering room, Italy had a tremendous amount of independence. And it used it well. And I very much hope that this challenge will again, this challenge is before you. We're in the turning point to the Second Italian Republic. Let there be no mistake about it. And rather than thinking of of your heritage as merely that of clever politicians, one should understand it is built on sacrifice for the principles of modern liberal constitutionalism, and perhaps some of you will have to sacrifice as well, but you should do it. Thank you very much.